When I was 14, I lived in a small suburb in the Midwest, full of ordinary people who didn't quite share my interests in goth metal and David Lynch movies. So I often took to the internet to meet people with like-minded interests in hopes of some stimulating conversation. Add to that, I had recently come out as gay to a couple of close friends along with my mother who did not take the news well at all. I didn't know any gay people in real life, so at the time the internet felt like the only place to meet other people sharing similar experiences. This was back in the days of dial-up, when it wasn't too uncommon for strangers to strike up an IM conversation based solely on their AOL profile. One day I received a message from a guy around my age named Steven. It started off pretty normal. We talked about our favorite music and movies, how much we hated school, and all the celebrities we thought were cute. He eventually revealed that he was 16 and was living with his older brother because his parents had kicked him out of the house for being gay. I thought it was cool to meet someone who lived nearby that was old enough to drive and didn't live with their parents, so we decided to meet up after a couple of weeks of long chat sessions. I knew my parents would not be cool with me meeting a stranger from the internet, so I lied and told them that he was a mutual friend of another friend they already knew and trusted. Once the plan was set, he showed up on a Friday evening in an old beat-up pickup truck. To my relief, he didn't look like a creepy old Catfish stalker. In fact, he looked just like his pictures. Red hair, goofy smile, but definitely not unattractive. We went for a ride, grabbed a bite to eat, stopped at a guitar store, and caught a new movie at the theater. I was so excited to have a friend with similar interests who knew about the pressures of being gay in a small town and was happy to chauffeur me around. I decided I didn't want the fun to end once curfew drew closer and asked if he wanted to crash at my place. I had a trundle bed that pulled out from underneath my bed so he could sleep comfortably without the pressure of something sexual happening. After watching a DVD, we both passed out for about an hour when suddenly there's a loud knock at the front door. My parents awoke to find a police officer, also a friend of the family as my dad was a retired cop, standing at the door. I went out into the living room to see what was going on, and he proceeds to tell us that they received an anonymous phone call that someone in our house has been communicating with a wanted pedophile. My parents went into my room and where my computer was and forced me to downgrade my AOL account to kids only while my new friends slept soundly nearby. I told them I had no idea what they were talking about, but since I was pretty much the only person using the internet extensively in our family, they said I would be banned from regular use until the mystery was solved. The next day, Steven and I were out for a ride just enjoying the day, when all of a sudden we were passing an oncoming SUV who slammed on his brakes and did a squealing 180 only to begin tailgating us and honking his horn furiously. I was screaming at my friend to slow down and asking if he knew what was going on. Who was this crazy person behind us? He didn't say a word. We wound up in a high-speed chase that felt like hours but probably only lasted about 5 minutes. Steven finally pulled over and jumped out of the car and motioned for me to follow him, so I did. As we're getting out, the driver behind us headed straight for me and went to punch me square in the face, but stopped mere centimeters before actually hitting me. I pulled away from his shaking fist and saw a man in his 30s with eyes bulging out of his head, literally. I much later realized he had Graves' disease, which if any of you have seen what it looks like, it's nothing short of terrifying on an angry man about to beat you to a pulp. This man went on to tell me that my friend was actually 21 years old and that he was his boyfriend, and that I needed to stay out of their lives if I wanted to live to see tomorrow. Once the initial shock and confusion wore off, I was absolutely broken. Scary Graves guy took off with Steven and left me in the dust. I made my way home and didn't say a word to my parents, just locked myself in my room and cried harder than I've ever cried before. I felt pretty damn stupid and ashamed for being so naive. I hoped that the whole thing would just blow over without anyone ever finding out, but the story didn't end there. My older sister and I had our own landline phone number separate from the main house phone that we shared, and kept that answering machine in my room. I came home from school one day and noticed my mom was already home, which was odd because she didn't usually get home from work until a few hours later. I went straight to my mom to find a new message on the machine. It was the Graves dude, who went to leave a voicemail, but my sister had picked up mid-message so I could hear their conversation over the recording. He pretended to be a faculty member of my school and asked for my mom's work number. He wound up calling her and giving her a detailed account of just who exactly I had been hanging around with. I went out to the back patio where my parents sat, looking just absolutely devastated as they informed me 2 FBI agents were on their way to get a report about my experience with Stephen, who, by the way, wasn't actually named Stephen. It was a fake name he had given me. Once the agents arrived, they informed me that he was wanted for alleged molestation of 2 children, one of them as young as 10 years old. Needless to say, I was sick beyond belief and angry to boot. I complied with everything they asked me to do and agreed to testify against him on trial. I wasn't going to let this liar get away with hurting any more kids, and apparently the other families involved were so embarrassed they didn't want to testify, leaving only me to do something about it. Around this time, I received a late-night phone call from Stephen's boyfriend asking if I was okay, checking up on how I was doing, and eventually turning the conversation around to a more flirtatious tone and complimenting me on my musical tastes, appearance, etc. At this point, I realized that this wasn't just a jealous, possessive boyfriend involved in a game of cat and mouse, but rather some kind of partner in crime who reveled in younger boys just as much as his disgusting significant other. I quickly hung up and never spoke to him again, though he did attempt to call me a few more times after that according to the caller ID. Fast forward 1 year when Stephen's court date finally arrived. I went to the courthouse downtown with my mom and was informed by an attorney that he took a plea deal and would be sentenced to jail for 1 year. Yep, that's right, folks. He only got 1 year because his victims refused to come forward and testifying. Another year later, I was 16 and finally had my own car along with a great group of supportive friends. I had pretty much buried this memory far away in the deep recesses of my mind and never really thought much more about the encounter, until one day I started receiving IMs from an unknown screen name. These instant messages consisted of death threats and facts about me that he could only have known from driving by my house and stalking me, like what kind of car I drove, the types of clothes I liked to wear, and what my daily schedule primarily consisted of. This went on for a couple of weeks from various mystery handles, sharing in explicit detail how I was going to die. I was pretty freaked out and kept a close watch wherever I went. However, I never saw him creeping around in spite of the heightened awareness of my surroundings. I eventually printed the items out and shared them with my school principal along with the police, assuming no doubt it was Stephen attempting to contact me again, hell-bent on revenge. After filing a report, I luckily never heard from him again. I don't know what became of him. I don't even remember what his real name was. I can only hope something truly horrible has happened to him since all of this transpired. This is a story I kept from my friends for a very long time, and to this day many people in my life don't know about it. It's still a delicate subject, but a story I felt compelled to share. I've since received counseling and live a very happy life as a 28-year-old far, far away from that dreadful little town, and any stranger who attempts to contact me on Facebook gets blocked immediately. The day before I received the first text, I had been at a festival. Being the reckless 16-year-old that I was, I got too intoxicated and don't really remember much. I somehow made it home about 9 a.m. the following day, and around probably early afternoon, I wake up to a text from a random number asking, "Who is this?" Now at this point I was terribly hungover and out of it, so guess this text was from someone I embarrassingly gave my number to at the festival. So I text back asking if I met them last night, and he says he couldn't remember. The conversation is pretty much normal for a small while as I tried to work out who this person was. I eventually asked him if he could send a picture of himself so I could try and remember talking to him the day before. He asked me if I received the picture and I didn't, so then I just asked him for his name. We'll call him Jack, but this name didn't ring any bells to my hungover, still half-drunken self at the time and stupidly kept talking to him. I was asking all the people I went to the festival with if they remembered a guy named Jack and nobody knew, so it was pretty weird, but I was hanging too hard to think straight. This is when things started to sound a bit off to me. He asked how old I was and where I lived, to which I answered and asked him the same. He told me he was 17 and lived in the same place, so I took it as they were someone in the exact same situation as me, unable to remember who they met last night. Now, what he said next might ring alarm bells for others, and almost rang mine, but things like this are asked a lot by desperate boys around my area. He asked if I was single, and from that point on I really didn't care for speaking to whoever this was, so I ignored them and went back to sleep. I woke up again, slightly less hungover and thinking more straight. I remember reading through my texts with Jack and something clicked. I felt a bit uneasy as I remembered a few months back one of my friends used a guy named Jack's phone from her work to call me, and the day after he wouldn't quit texting me until he said he'd delete my number, and I had heard nothing since. I immediately texted her, asking if a guy named Jack still worked with her and if this was his number. She replied saying yes, and I swear my blood ran cold. I even started to think I was dreaming or something because this is the kind of things you hear and you never expect it to happen to yourself. I sent her screenshots of my text with him and she seemed really creeped out, telling me he was a dirty man in his late 50s and that he had been sending weird texts to another one of her colleagues, far weirder than those I received, but I won't mention what they said out of respect for her privacy. It was a bit of a creep to her in person, too. This shook me up a bit, so I told my mom, who was absolutely livid. She told me if he contacted me again that she'd call the police. Fast forward to a few days after, I was in town waiting for my mom to pick me up and take me home to change for work when I got a text coming through from Jack. I was thinking, oh God, not again, and opened it to see a picture of some teenage guy with, "Did you get it yet? This is me," or something afterwards. I knew this wasn't him, so ignored it and told my mom when I got in the car, and we called the police when I got home, and they arranged to visit with me when I got home from work, which was quite late and my shift finished around 10 p.m. They arrived and my idiot phone had reset itself, causing me to lose all my texts and pictures, so I couldn't even show them the text from before, but could show them the recent ones of him asking why I wasn't replying and stuff along those lines. As the police were on my phone, he texted me, which I found quite funny as he was unaware who they were being viewed by. We shared the information about how he had harassed the girls I know who work with him, and as much as we knew about the guy, and they said they'd dig up some dirt on him and take a visit to his workplace. They said they couldn't do much about the text because it wasn't classed as harassment due to me ignoring him instead of telling him to stop, but what he'd done to the other girls was enough for them to take action. After they left, I texted him asking him not to text me again, and he replied with something like, "Why? What did I do?" but never contacted me again after that. The police knocked on my door a few days after, telling me they were going to visit him later on today and would tell us what happened after. If I remember correctly, this whole thing is kind of a blur in some places as I don't like to think about it much. They never got back to me, but luckily for me, I got all the gossip I needed from my friend who worked there. She had let everyone know about what he had done, so pretty much everyone else working with him had been avoiding him, and I think he got quite angry about that. Apparently, the police came in and requested to talk to him in private, and they took him outside. When he came back in, she said he was very grumpy, obviously from the telling off. She soon found out that the picture he had sent me was of his own son, which is so completely messed up. His son found out what he had done and threatened to beat him up, rightly so. Finally, the workplace fired him, and I had to do a statement for all their evidence so they could win if he took them to court. Last thing I heard of him was that he moved well away from the area, which relieved me so much as I like to take walks most days down to where he lived, which refrained me from doing so out of fear. There are some other things I should mention for me added to how creepy it was, but I wasn't sure where to put them. In between the time gap where he first texted me after my friend used his phone and when he texted me after the festival, I went down to the workplace to speak to the owners about getting a job there. At one point, I was sat smoking with pretty much all of the other staff outside, and I was sat opposite to him. This makes me feel so uneasy because that whole time he must have known who I was, and maybe him seeing me then made him want to try to catfish me or whatever. My friend also told me at the time he was trying to send the fake picture of his son. He was walking around the workplace trying to find stronger Wi-Fi to send it and getting really frustrated. And one more thing. One thing that I just found out was that he had tried contacting me on WhatsApp. I was looking at his Facebook profile and I recognized his profile picture from a message I got off of some random guy on WhatsApp, but I shook it off as those random messages you get sometimes. Ew. I don't recall what date he sent a message on there, and I don't have that app anymore, but I thought it was worth noting. I actually feel a lot better after writing this out, and I have been meaning to for some time. What scares me the most are what his intentions were with me. I hope this has taught him a lesson and stopped him from thinking that he can just try this with anyone else. I had just moved to London, and being a bit lonely and wanting to get into the dating scene, I tried the whole OkCupid thing. It was alright. I honestly wasn't too active on it. I'd check my account a few times a week and message some profiles of girls that I thought were pretty. 95% of the time my messages would go unanswered. I guess it was mostly because many of my messages in retrospect were pretty uncreative and dry. One day I was messing around looking through various profiles when I saw an extremely attractive girl and decided I had to message her. In my opinion, she was a perfect 10. Not just the fact that she was a gorgeous blonde, but we liked a lot of the same music and movies as well, and I could actually send her a decent email because of all the things we had in common. I also need to reiterate that her pictures were smoking, which most likely definitely clouded my judgment, and I should also mention that I'm a former military and Afghan veteran, so nothing really scares me. Almost immediately after pressing send, she responded. We messaged each other through the OkCupid messenger service for about a week, and I got to learn a lot about her. She had an interesting name, Aoife, and she was from Belfast. She told me she had a daughter named Rosalind, which didn't really bother me, and had a very long, complicated story about how she grew up a Catholic in North Ireland during the Troubles and was orphaned at a young age. She seemed really driven and had such an amazing story. I had so many questions, and in all reality, a lot of respect for her, so it was really easy to keep talking to her. Within about another week, we started talking on the phone and then sometimes on Skype. She'd never do an actual video chat, which at the time I didn't think was too weird, but she'd send me pictures of her and her daughter, friends, etc. For the most part, this whole thing seemed legit. The stories she had were pretty detailed, and she was talking about stuff that I really didn't know a lot about and honestly couldn't comprehend. Then there were parts of the story that seemed to get kind of weird and didn't add up. At first she told me that she was a hairstylist at some swank place in central London. I don't really frequent Central a lot, so okay, no biggie. I just met her online. I wasn't going to head into Central to stalk her at work. Then she said she owned a bar in Camden called the Lock Tavern, which I looked up on the internet and is a real place, and managed it on weekends. She had details about the bouncers and regulars. This didn't seem to make a lot of sense, but okay. I mean, I guess you could do both jobs and be a full-time mom. It seemed odd, but she seemed driven, and she also seemed really hot, so who was I to judge? Again, I wasn't going to be super creeper and pop down there. I just took her word for it. She also said she lived in a really nice penthouse near Covent Garden, which if anyone knows the London real estate market, didn't seem plausible on a hairdresser barmaid's wages. She explained this by saying that she had fallen into some money after the Troubles. It seemed kind of far-fetched, but again, without actually meeting her, who am I to judge? I started to notice some other weird things. She'd send me pictures, and in some of them certain tattoos were present, and in some they weren't. I figured she was just sending old pictures, but I remember that is what started to tip me off that things were fishy to say the least. But again, there's really nothing wrong with sending old pictures, and I had no real reason not to believe the photos were Aoife. They all seemed like the same girl, and with the exception of the tattoos and some small changes in hair color, nothing really seemed out of the ordinary. She would also send me pictures of her daughter, Roisin, who she claimed was 14. Finally, after talking to Aoife for a few weeks online, I asked her out on a date. I figured it was time I finally meet her. We're set to meet up on a Friday night, and on that Friday she doesn't respond to a single text or call. I had nowhere to meet her. By around 9 p.m., she texts saying things got out of control at her pub, and she was really sorry, but she had to cancel. I was upset and should have bailed there, but I forgave her and we agreed to set up another first meeting. Things from here really started to get weird. As I said, I was doing the online dating thing, and in this time I'd met a few other girls. Another girl named Jo had asked me out. I went out with Jo one night in an area of London called Shoreditch, which isn't too far from where Aoife's pub was. While I was out, Aoife called and texted me a few times. I basically just ignored the calls. When the date was over, I said bye to Jo and went home and called Aoife. She asked where I was, and basically, well, I lied. I said I was out with a friend. Aoife didn't say anything, and we talked on the phone for a bit and then said goodnight. This situation got strange a few nights later when Aoife caught me in my lie. She claimed that she knew that I was out with another girl. She knew which restaurant I was at and the night that I had been there. She knew what Jo had looked like. Aoife claimed that one of the bouncers from her pub knew what I looked like because she had shown him photos and he recognized me when I came through the doors at the restaurant in Shoreditch. This didn't make a lot of sense because I didn't see any bouncers at the restaurant we were at, but maybe he was bartending or something, I didn't know. She had details and they were spot on. This was odd, to say the least. I basically told Aoife that the date was set up before I'd even met her, and that we weren't really dating, so she had no right to be upset. Plus, she stood me up, so if anyone should be mad, it's me. To be honest, I forget what really happened in this part of the story. I think we fought for a little bit, didn't talk for a few weeks, then one night she called me really late. It seemed off, so I answered. She was panicking. From what I could tell, she was suffering from sleep paralysis, which I know is scary, so I stayed on the phone with her until she went back to sleep. This happened a few more times. I really had no intention to date or even see her. I went home to the US for about a month, and while we did keep limited contact, there was nothing too serious, and my expectations were pretty low. After I'd gotten back to London, she invited me out. I don't remember much of the details, but she ended up canceling on me again. I basically decided, screw it. I wasn't even upset. We'd texted a little bit, but the communications really started to die down. I really didn't think much about it and went on with my life. Then one night, I entered the Twilight Zone. One day I was in the King's Cross, St. Pancras area with a friend of mine from the States. He had to make a meeting nearby, so I was by myself in the area. That's when I got a text from Aoife. She asked if I wanted to meet up, and I figured, hey, might as well finally meet this girl. I was in the same area of town, 2 stops away, and didn't see any harm in it. She told me to meet her up in Camden, and she'd be at the Weatherspoons pub at noon. It wasn't a date, at least in the romantic sense, which was good, and at this point I was really curious as to who she was. I'd literally spent hours talking and texting this girl. So I don't know Camden that well, and I'm getting texts from her on the way up there as I'm trying to find the Weatherspoons. It's right by the lock in Camden, by the way. She's telling me she's at work and in the process of selling her share in the bar, but she's on her way. Another friend of hers is at the bar, but he's a great guy, you'll like him. Again, I was already right there, might as well meet her friend. That's when I meet Reese. Reese was a tall, skinny ginger kid. He was about 21 and had a thick Irish accent. I walked up to him, shook his hand, and we got drinks. He seemed nice enough, and for as weird as the situation could potentially be, it wasn't all that uncomfortable. Another one of his friends was there as well. They seemed like 2 nerds in their early 20s. They talked about football and video games and all the other stuff 20-something-year-old kids talk about, mixed in with a little bit of politics and a couple random questions about, how do you know Aoife, etc. I'd been in Afghanistan fighting the Taliban a few years prior. This situation wasn't anything to be concerned about, I thought to myself. Then I got a text from Aoife, something along the lines of, hey, getting tied up, be there in about an hour. Reese seemed nice enough, so we hung out, got a few beers, and moved on to the next pub. Still no Aoife. Reese and his friend were nice. We did rounds, and fortunately I hold my beer pretty well. Another apologetic text from Aoife rolls in. Screw it. We're drinking, I thought, and we're having a good time enough. Reese would ask me random questions about Aoife, but I basically shrugged it off to being one of the only few things we had in common. We bar hopped around Camden and went to the Holly Arms. At one point I was in the queue to buy a round of drinks and felt like this guy was way too close to me. I turned around and saw an overweight old man with an ugly brown jacket and a pockmarked face. He had a crucifix tattoo on his neck. In all honesty, a typical barfly you'd see in a British pub. I said, "Excuse me," and walked past him. We continued to drink and blow the day away. By this time it was like 2:30 to 3 and Aoife is nearing 3 hours late. I decided, screw it. Let's go to the Lock Tavern, her bar. Reese and his friends seem cool with it. We get there and there's 2 Irish tricolors flying above the place. "Yeah, you can tell Aoife owns the place, huh?" Reese said. The part of the story kinda added up. We went into her place and I texted her to tell her we're there. "Oh great, I'm almost done. I'll be down in a minute." She never comes down. But this is when the story gets really, really weird. This other dude named Pete shows up, shakes Reese's hand, and Reese says, "Oh, you're here to meet Eva." Keep in mind that Aoife and Aoife are phonetically almost identical names. I look at Reese and he's like, "Ah, this must seem weird. Eva is Aoife's best friend." Now this seemed really weird, but I needed to figure out what was going on. These 2 girls have almost exactly the same name, and I had never heard Aoife mentioned Eva before. I start talking to Pete, and Reese starts asking similar questions to him about Eva that he was asking me about Aoife. But some of these questions were getting more serious. He was asking him things like, "Do you love her?" Pete's story then starts to sound eerily similar to mine. Pete meets Eva online. She's from North Ireland, has a daughter named Roshan. In his version, she's 12. He tried to meet up with her a few times, but it fell through. He was invited last minute to hang out. Oh, that's weird, is all I could think. Something wasn't right. At this point I knew that someone was getting played, probably me, and I was in some kind of game but needed to figure out exactly what was going on. Pete and I started to figure out things right about the same time, and right in front of Reese, who stuck to his guns in the story remarkably well. They both have similar names. They both have daughters that are around the same age with a really common Irish name. I'm not buying it. Neither is Pete. I decide that the pub we're in right now might not be friendly territory, and I don't want to get shanghaied in Camden, so I suggest we leave. Aoife sends me a text saying she's almost on her way. Great, I said. Meet us up the street at some other pub. Pete and I start walking out. On my way out, I ask the bartender, "Hey, is Aoife working today?" He responds, "No, mate. Aoife hasn't worked here in 3 years." At this point, I know something really, really creepy is going on. We head to the next pub. I've got a good buzz going, but I know I need to sober up, and sober up fast. I think Pete might be a victim in this game too, but he might not be. He for sure can't be trusted. Reese and his buddy are suspected as well, but I don't have any proof yet, and my curiosity is keeping me there. We walk into another pub. Reese's friend says something to Reese and I don't hear it. Neither does Pete. Reese loses it. He yells at his friend and his friend basically says, "Screw off, I'm out," and takes off. Pete and I are still trying to put things together. I find a table on an outdoor deck. It's quiet. I can think and I can piece this together. It's amazing how fast you can sober up when you think you're in trouble. I ask Pete if he has any pictures of Eva, and Pete pulls out his phone. He shows me a picture that I'd seen before. Wait, that's Roshan, Aoife's daughter. No, mate, that's Eva, Pete replies. This is making no sense. I've been sent the same picture of the same girl and been told it was Aoife's 14-year-old daughter. I showed Pete pictures that I had of Aoife. He claimed he'd never seen the girl in the photos before. Reese was sticking to the story that I had pictures of Aoife and Pete had pictures of Eva, and that he wasn't sure why I thought the pic was of Roshan. He also kept claiming that Aoife and Eva texted him and they were on their way. That's when it dawned on me. I simply looked at Pete and asked him, "What number do you have in your phone for Eva?" Pete reads the number on his phone, and it turns out being the exact same number I had for Aoife in my phone. If all the other clues hadn't added up, this one sent it over the edge. It also sent Pete out of the bar as he literally jumped over a table and ran out the door in a panic. It was actually quite the sight to see. At this point, it was just me and Reese. I don't think that he had overheard that we both had the same number for someone that he was telling me were two separate girls. Reese said that Aoife and Eva had texted him and that they're on their way. I don't know who Aoife and Eva are at this point, or if they even exist. I basically tell Reese that I think he's playing some kind of messed up game and that he's more than suspect of wrongdoing. He wasn't a big dude and knew that if he stepped to me it wasn't going to end well. I basically walked right through him, knocking him into a door frame and tore out of the bar. I headed straight for the tube. I needed to jump on the northern line and get home. I wasn't waiting for anything. At this point I had no idea what was going on. At best, I'd been in some sort of weird Manti-Teo type Catfish scam. At worst, I was also a victim in a snuff movie. I get on the tube and there's a guy right behind me. I look at him. He's overweight, pockmarked face, brown jacket. We make eye contact. I look at his neck and there's the crucifix tattoo. It was the same guy from the Holly Arms. I'm a bit worried, but I've been under worse pressure before in my life. I calmly sat down on the train. The train was being held in Camden for some reason and wasn't moving. That's when who jumps on the same carriage as the two of us? Reese. I could have sworn he made eye contact and gave a nod to the man in the brown jacket. At this point I played dumb that they were there. On the London Tube there's a certain dinging noise that's made right before the doors close. I waited to hear that noise, then bolted out of the door. I ran around and doubled back on the tube several times. When I finally got back near home, I texted a friend in New Cross and told her I was scared and I was being followed. She was having a party that night and invited me over. I really didn't want to head home alone. At this point, I think I doubled back and switched lines enough that if Reese and the man in the brown coat were following me, I'd lost them. I made it to New Cross safe and sound. I had a few calls from Aoife the next few days, but I never wanted to answer them. She also sent a few texts saying we needed to talk. Eventually, she stopped calling and texting altogether. I have a few theories on the whole situation. One of my friends thinks that Reese and Aoife are the same person. I wouldn't rule it out, but the person I talked to on the phone definitely sounded like a woman. To those of you who are dating online and meeting sketchy people, be safe about it. Never let your curiosity get to you like it did me. If there's anyone out there who has any idea what was going on, feel free to share or play your theories off me. I'm still baffled by the whole thing. I am an almost 28-year-old gay male who was born and raised in the Appalachian Mountains, which for my friends not in America, that's in the South more towards the Mid-Atlantic region. I usually don't just throw being gay out there, but it's important to my tale and to understanding why I made such insanely poor choices in my teenage years. I know almost everyone does, but this really takes the cake. Follow me back to when I was 16, just about 12 years ago. I was a junior in high school, had plenty of friends, and no trouble with bullies. At least not while I was at school. My parents are now wonderful people who greatly regret the way they treated me when they found out I was gay. At the time I hated them for being so horrendous to me, but as I got older I finally understood that their reaction was just a product of the strict religious movement they and myself were brought up in. My parents, who at the time firmly believed that this would send my eternal soul into damnation, pretty much only allowed me to stay at our house a couple of days a week after that. For at least a year I was living on friends' couches and off the kindness of their parents. I was in what I can only describe as the worst state of miserable major depression I have ever been in my entire life. I have tried to commit suicide the year before with a very serious overdose that cost me 9 days in the ICU. I should have died, but your liver is an amazing thing and it started to regenerate on its own. A year to the day after that, literally to the day, the first guy I ever fell in love with was killed in a tragic car accident. My parents had zero sympathy for my feelings. They were the immoral feelings of their blasphemous son, so they didn't count, I guess. I remember coming back home from his funeral that night and my father asking me, "Why are you so upset? Were you dating that boy or something?" I didn't even respond, just walked right past him and straight into my room where I proceeded to cry myself to sleep. Again, don't judge them too harshly. They were different people back then. Needless to say, this sent me completely spiraling downwards in the worst possible way. Drugs, alcohol, you name it, I did it. Anything to stay numb and keep myself from feeling the immense amounts of pain I was in emotionally every single day. To have your situation go from a year before seeing your father cry for the first time as you lay dying in a hospital bed to him spewing so much malice and hatred towards you, let's just say it was enough to make anyone have a mental breakdown. I had friends who cared about and loved me deeply. I don't know why that wasn't enough. It just wasn't. I felt like no one truly loved me or ever would. Hell, if my own parents couldn't then, what were my chances with finding a soulmate? Would I just be alone forever and as miserable as I was then? At the time, in my angsty teen mind, that's exactly what it felt like. Which finally brings us through my background and mindset leading into the pure, unadulterated hell that was soon to follow. In the midst of my deepest, darkest despair, the brightest idea anyone has ever had on this planet popped into my head. Well, if no one around here will ever love me, then I'll just go online and try to meet someone who will. Pure stroke of genius, right? It just made absolute biblical sense to me at the time. I felt like the only gay teen in the whole damn state, like the only person who really understood me was me, and only ever would be me. That in order to find someone to love me, I would have to search far and wide beyond the borders of the mountain fortress I had resided in my entire life. Proud of myself for having such an ingenious idea, I immediately hopped on my MySpace, Facebook for us old people, for all you young folks saying, "What is MySpace?" and spent the next hour making it as cool looking as I thought I could. You could customize just about everything on your profile, so of course mine had to accurately reflect all my emo feelings in the darkness of my soul. Word to the wise, and something I wish I realized back then, if you're trying to attract the darker things in society, you're probably gonna get back exactly what you're sending out. I know I sure as hell did. It all started out innocently enough. I clicked on one of my gay acquaintances' profiles, and for some reason this guy on his top 8 just flew right out at me. His name was Jacob. He was gorgeous, dressed in all black, and that was pretty much all I needed to know at the time. I saw he was from Maryland, several hours away from me, but far enough to possibly not be like everyone else here. Far enough to hopefully have exactly the kind of mentality that I was looking for in another human being. So I sent him a message. Something lame to the effect of, "Hi, what's up? I saw you on my friend's top 8 and thought you were cute, so I figured I would say hello." I wasn't expecting a response, none whatsoever. He was so gorgeous and seemed way too cool for me, so why in God's name would he message a guy like me back? And then it happened. Within a minute of me sending my message, I got one back. It was from him. Not gonna lie, I exploded in joy on the inside, something that I hadn't felt in years and years. It was just something like, "Hey, you're cute too. How old are you?" But it was enough to send me over the moon. I felt alive again, but what I really felt was hope again. We talked the rest of the day and night away. We talked about each other, how much life sucked, how bad we wanted away from our hometown and our lives. You know, the usual for teenage gay boys living in repression. I fell for him hard. Too hard. I mean hook, line, and sinker hard. We chatted for maybe a week before he asked me out. I had no problem with dating online. Hell, that was the whole point of me doing this in the first place, so I eagerly said yes. We had only been dating for a week after that or so when he introduced me to the rest of his friends. I met his ex-boyfriend Zachary and their best friend Josie, who I quickly became best friends with, along with about 10 other girls and guys. Josie was a cool chick and she had known these guys for years. Who better to give me all the dirt on them, right? During the course of the next month, Josie and I became the closest friends out of everyone he introduced me to in what turned out to be a gang. They were mostly just a group of suburban white kids who called themselves the Elites and just drank and smoked a lot of weed. I had heard some crazy stories here and there about them beating up and some of them taking the gang thing way too seriously, but I didn't really think much about it. Josie and I had been talking on the phone every single day and really made a genuine connection with each other. She had my sense of bizarre humor, was extremely intelligent, and still liked to have a crazy good time on top of it all. During this period, Jacob and I were doing great, but there was one little problem. I had started to fall in love with his ex, Zachary, the more I talked to him. Jacob could be intense and at times violent when he was angry, from what I heard, but on the other hand, Zachary was his complete opposite. He was too kind for his own good, an extremely caring guy, and he wrote the most beautiful piano music I had ever heard. Being a musician myself, French horn for 10 years, I was immediately endeared to this guy. The more and more time I spent online talking to Zachary, the less and less time I felt like talking to Jacob. Eventually, Jacob kind of figured out what was going on, and to my shock, he let me know he was cool with it and wished us the best. That's how after about 2 months with Jacob, I started dating his ex Zachary. This would be the guy I would date for the next 2 years, and with whom the worst times of my life would be spent. Josie was clearly thrilled for me, and we still talked every day online and on the phone. Sometimes I talked to Zachary on the phone, but more often than not, we would just communicate over AOL Instant Messenger. When we started dating was when everything started to collapse. Jacob, who initially said he was okay with everything, ended up exploding. He completely tore me a new one online and then proceeded to go and kidnap my current boyfriend. Josie called me up, freaking the hell out, saying he'd taken Zachary and no one knew where they were. This clearly sent me reeling from shock. I guess all the rumors I had heard about Jacob were true, and now because of my actions, the guy I'm in love with is in danger. I quickly contacted some of the older guys in the gang and let them know what was going on. Their response was basically, not again, which caught me off guard. Again? You mean this happens frequently? I talked to Chaz, the leader of this gang, while he sent some guys out to deal with Jacob and retrieve my boyfriend. He basically told me in a nutshell that Jacob has been and always will be obsessed with Zachary. That when he gets wasted on whatever, he goes cuckoo for Cocoa Puffs and sets out on some wild mission to kidnap and apparently violate my new boyfriend. I couldn't believe it. I was in complete and total shock. Apparently the situation was resolved easily and he handed over my man without too much incident. He also received a healthy beating to remind Jacob that it's not nice to go around kidnapping people just because you can. This was the first and certainly not the last incident I can remember where a pattern I'm all too familiar with now would develop over the next several years. Jacob would get drunk and jealous. He would do something completely insane to me or my boyfriend, and then after all the freaking out and worrying was over with, he would come crying back to me begging mine and Zachary's forgiveness. This became a weekly routine, and it began to wear me out mentally very quickly. Flash forward to around a year after I sent the very first message to Jacob. I was still with Zachary, still best friends with Josie, who I had even been up to Maryland and met in person at this point, unfortunately to miss my boyfriend who was out of town visiting family, and was still dealing with Jacob's craptastic, insane plots to ruin my relationship and give me a stroke before the age of 20. None of this craziness set off any red flags in my head, not one. As a matter of fact, nothing period during that entire year gave me second thoughts about anything going on really. That day-to-day the sky is falling lifestyle had become the norm for me and I was used to it. Several of my friends, however, had their doubts, though they were polite enough to keep them to themselves for the time being. This was when the first true danger that threatened me and my family ever arose, and it led to a night I will never forget as long as I live. Cut to me as a 17-year-old who in the span of 1 year had accomplished everything he set out to do. I had the perfect boyfriend, even if I'd never met him, didn't care. I had an awesome new best friend in Josie. We'd hung out a few times at that point and I adored her, and I had joined a group of my own in my hometown. If my parents were going to throw me away just because of who I loved, well then I was going to throw away every single religious thing I had ever been taught and go to the dark side. I became a Luciferian, otherwise known as a Satanist, and boy oh boy did I think I was hardcore now. Now when it comes to the coven I joined in my hometown, that could fill an entirely different story. Now, I received a call one night around 12 a.m. from Josie, who was almost beside herself, very out of character for her. Zachary had been kidnapped over 40 times in the past year, and she hardly batted an eye, but this was different. She explained to me that Jacob had really outdone himself and lost his mind this time. He had hired a guy from the elites named Sean to come down to my house and kill me, plus my mother, father, and younger sister. My sister is about 7.5 years younger than me, and from the day she was born, I have always been fiercely protective over her. She was, and still is, my beautiful baby sister, and truly the only one in my household that I loved at the time. When I heard that my ex had taken it so far as to hire a hitman to come after my family, I flew into what we around here call a mountain rage. It didn't matter to me if someone simply came after me, but to target my precious sister who had nothing to do with any of this was the boiling point for me. And even though I despised my parents at the time, I'm still a Southerner, and when you mess with a Southerner's family, then all the crap you're fighting about goes right out the window. Complete and total defend the homestead mode kicked in. I asked Josie when he left Maryland. She told me she found out that he started driving towards my house maybe an hour ago, and as soon as she found out, she called me immediately. Okay, so that meant I had at the most 6 hours to prepare, and at the least possibly 4 if he got a good head start. She also informed me that Sean was a former Army guy, but got kicked out for failing several psych tests and being a complete sociopath in general. I'm not a big guy, and at the time I weighed even less than I do now. I was 5'7" and maybe weighed 130 pounds soaking wet, but my first thought didn't require brute strength to beat back this attacker. I called up my coven leader Brandon, who lived not even 10 minutes away from me, and explained the situation. I told him I needed to borrow his favorite toy, and I promised to bring it back in good condition with as little blood on it as possible. He agreed. About 30 minutes later, I was back home in my room, cleaning and loading an extremely nice over and under pump-action shotgun. Like I said, no brute force required. I called Josie back up and got the details on exactly what he and his car looked like. Then around 4 a.m. I told her I would call her back and crept out into my front yard. Now for people who have never been to my house, they always got where to park at wrong. They always ended up in front of my house down a hill instead of in the driveway on the side. This little detail was stuck in my mind and probably saved my life. In the very front of my yard there was a huge oak tree that was big enough for my skinny, girl jean wearing emo self to hide perfectly behind. All I had to do was wait and hope he did exactly what I thought he would. I got so lucky. He parked exactly on the opposite side of the big tree I was hiding behind. I heard a car door open and someone step outside of the vehicle, shortly followed by the unmistakable cocking of a 9mm handgun. While that sound may have struck fear in the hearts of others, it absolutely enraged me to the core. So I replied in kind with a sound of my own. As I stepped around the side of the tree, he was directly in front of his car, gunned down by his side. In one motion, I simultaneously pumped a shell into the chamber of my shotgun and raised it directly with his head about 10 feet away from me. This caught him off guard and completely by surprise. I didn't hesitate. I simply told him the God's honest truth. I said, "Buddy, you got one of two options right now. You can either get back in your car, turn around and drive straight back to Maryland without stopping, or you can so much as flinch in my general direction, and I will splatter your brains all across the yard. You have 5 seconds to decide. What's it gonna be?" I kid you not, the most sickly smile spread across this psycho's face, and for a moment I thought we were about to reenact the movie Tombstone. Fortunately, he had much more of a sense of self-preservation than I thought someone who had just drove 8 hours to kill a family he never met would have. All he did was give a little chuckle and said, "You're a cool dude. See you around." He then walked backwards very slowly, my gun following him the entire way, got back into his car, and just drove off. Right then and there, I made up my mind. I had to tackle the beast head on. I was always raised that if you have a problem, be a man and take care of it yourself. I had to go to my enemy Jacob's home turf and bring this war to his doorstep just like he brought it to mine. It was time to go to Maryland. After all the drama of nearly being murdered by a nutjob, I'd really had enough of Jacob's BS at this point. I got online and cussed him out until a fly wouldn't land on him, making a point to let him know that his little plan backfired. He wasn't dealing with some poor little boy that couldn't fend for himself, and each and every crazy situation that evolved had made me stronger as a person, if not a little bit more mentally disturbed every time. I told him he was going to regret the day he ever crossed me and my boyfriend. Instead of apologizing like usual, his true colors finally came out. He laughed at me. He freaking laughed at me. He told me I was cute when I was angry, and said what a dang shame it was that I didn't have a bullet hole in my head. He He wished that I was dead and that he never spoke to me in the first place because he was still in love, more likely insanely obsessed with his ex, my current boyfriend of a year, Zachary. He informed me that the war was just beginning, and he would do everything in his power to win Zachary back like he was some kind of adorable trophy you won for baking the best freaking pie at the county fair. I was incensed, completely livid and brimming to the edge with fury. I told him to watch his back because I'm coming for him. I called Josie and told her everything that happened and asked if I could come stay with her for a week. She excitedly agreed. Zachary was asleep for this whole ordeal and blissfully unaware that anything had happened. When he found out the next day, I think he was even more angry than I was. Fortunately for us, the gang leader Chaz liked Zachary a whole hell of a lot more than he did Jacob, so he hatched a plan with him. The idea was for them to kidnap Jacob like he had Zachary so many times before. They would be accomplishing this task while I was on my way up to Maryland, and when I got there, he would be mine to do with as I pleased. You can imagine the 8-hour drive up there, all the hideous and heinously brutal ideas that were going through my mind. I was going to inflict maximum amounts of pain on the guy that had caused so much in my own life, and I would relish every second of it. Unfortunately, or fortunately depending on how you look at it, my dreams of reviving the Spanish Inquisition on my ex's head never came to fruition. When I arrived in Maryland, Josie came skipping out to greet me, happy as a lark like always to see me. She had some good and bad news. I always asked for the bad news first, and the bad news was that Jacob had gotten tipped off by Kenny. God, I freaking loathe that guy, always meddling where he didn't belong, that everyone was coming for him. He made a hasty retreat and had intended to kidnap Zachary and take him on the run too. But that was the good news. Before he could get to him, Zachary had hopped on a bus and headed to New York to stay with his mom while things cooled off. As sad as I was that once again I had missed seeing him for the first time, I was just relieved he was out of harm's way, safe and sound. Again, no alarm bells going off that for the second time that I had made the trip up there, Zachary was not around. Josie called him on her cell, and he apparently picked up his mom's because he never had his own, and we got to enjoy one of the rare times we actually spoke on the phone. All was well. Now for a week of fun and plotting on what we were going to do to Jacob the next time he reared his ugly head. Later on that week, Josie wanted to drive down to an old colonial part of Maryland and go ghost hunting on these abandoned railroad tracks. However uneventful that may have been, we did end up inviting Sean to go with us. Turns out Psycho Dude actually felt bad. Well, almost. He blankly told me that if I didn't have the balls to stand up to him, he would have killed me and my whole family for just $500. Instead of killing him on the spot, which every fiber in my being was telling me to do, I decided to play nice and get him on my side. That way if Jacob ever tried that crap again, he would definitely tell him no because I'm the cool dude. Sometimes you catch more flies with honey. Anyways, the rest of the week was normal and a damn good time. Josie and I said our goodbyes and we parted ways, wishing each other a Merry Christmas and Happy New Year. The next couple of weeks was semi-normal, no word from Jacob at all, not even a peep. What a gift, I thought. I'll take it. Year 2 of my relationship began quite happily, believe it or not. Even my birthday month of January was an unusually good one. Then came the next couple months. 2 months which quite vividly live within me to this day. They also define my life for the next several years. This is when the sky stopped falling, and my world completely crumbled from beneath me in utter devastation. At the beginning of February, Josie had a sudden and urgent impulse to get away from her parents. Now I could completely understand that, so I happily agreed to let her come stay down south with me. I borrowed my best friend's car and drove 15 to 16 some odd hour trip all the way to Maryland and back. My parents were less than thrilled. They told me she couldn't live in the house with us. So I said fine, and shelled out my money to a local La Quinta Inn, where she and I lived for almost 2 weeks before my parents caved and let us back at my house. Now I forgot to mention something extremely important earlier about boyfriend Zachary. He was very sick. I mean, terminally ill, but we thought it wouldn't be for years. I was told he had cystic fibrosis and he needed a double lung transplant in order to live much longer. He was hospitalized in the beginning of February and rushed up the transplant list because his condition was so grave. I can't even begin to tell you how after the year we'd been through together, how badly I wanted to be by his side. Unfortunately, he was at a hospital in a part of the country that specializes in treating cystic fibrosis and was way too far for me to travel. Josie kept me in pretty good spirits about the whole thing. She had a lot of experience with cystic fibrosis since her sister died from it several years earlier. She reassured me that since he was so young and tried to take such good care of himself, that he would probably receive donor lungs very soon and be just fine. I tried not to worry too much, but in reality I worried myself sick. Losing him after getting him out of harm's way so many times before was not an option in my mind. How could we overcome so much only for him to succumb to this disease? Zachary and I talked constantly when he felt like it, and even though he was scared and alone, he said he felt like $1,000,000 knowing I was supporting him with my love no matter where I was. That made me feel wonderful being able to comfort him from so far away, and for a couple of weeks my comfort seemed to be doing the trick. Until one day. That day. My boyfriend died suddenly on February 14th, 2008. His lungs filled with fluid, he suffocated, and died. There was nothing anyone could do. I was completely and totally lost. Josie broke the news and I collapsed into the biggest mess you've ever seen in your life. She was still living with me at the time, so she tried to console me as best as she could, while she was shedding her own tears at the loss of her best friend. That forever ruined Valentine's Day for me. To this day, it only reminds me of loss and death. You don't realize how fragile your heart truly is until you've experienced a loss like that. Little did I know that even worse moments in my life were about to occur about a month later. I was headed on a course for total destruction, and still blissfully unaware of the one person who had been driving this crazy train from day one. Skip forward to March, St. Patrick's Day to be exact, a little over a month since Zachary had passed away. Josie had forcefully been returned to Maryland by her parents, seeing as how she had practically ran away. I was off in la-la land of booze, drugs, and more pain than either of those could cover up. I was chilling with my Satanist posse, doing what all normal American teenagers do on St. Patty's Day, pretending like we're Irish and testing the limits of alcohol poisoning. My alcohol tolerance back then was ridiculously high, so I had already drank an inordinate amount when my phone rang. It was Josie. I slurred my words as something to the effect of, "Hey girl, what you doing?" came bumbling out of my mouth. I announced to the room it was Josie, to which everyone replied, "Hey." She had lived with us for several months, and love or hate her, she had become an honorary Southerner. The next words out of her mouth once again sent my head spinning off into space and my world into complete chaos. "Zachary's not dead." I stopped breathing for a moment, and when I caught my breath, I asked her to repeat that again. She did. Except this time she added the fact that his life had been in danger, blah blah blah, so he had to hide even from me, blah blah. Jacob just had to think he was dead, blah blah blah. I could literally feel my brain dripping out from my ears as my mind turned into mush with every word out of her mouth. Then for the real kicker to my drunken mental meltdown, Zachary got on the phone. Sure enough, it was his voice. He apologized for what he had to do. I apologized for what I was about to do, which was scream and yell my lungs out, throw my phone into a wall, smashing it into a million pieces, and then proceeded to go from super hammered drunk to completely insane. I drank everything that wasn't nailed down. Who knows what other drugs I did on top of that, because I sure don't remember. I was literally having a complete and total mental breakdown. The last strand of sanity in my brain just snapped. I did this for a couple of more hours until I somehow drove back home, put on my work clothes, and tore out of the parking lot to go to my job in a city half an hour down the interstate with people chasing me trying to stop me. I don't recall any of what happened next, but apparently this is what I did. I showed up to work completely wasted and got fired from my good job. I called my father, freaking out in the parking lot of said job. He realized I was drunk and told me to stay there and he would come get me. Oh, how I wish crazy drunk me would have listened. Instead of doing that, I started driving on the interstate again, not caring if I lived or died, and obviously not caring about anyone else. According to the police report, I was tearing down the interstate at 130 miles per hour. I apparently hit 2 mile markers on the side of the road and blew out both my right-hand tires, but continued on driving with sparks shooting 50 feet out of the back of my car. I took the exit to the hospital going that fast and spun out, completely totaled what was left of my car. According to bystanders, I then proceeded to exit my vehicle and run across the damn interstate towards the hospital with people chasing after me. Once I got to the ER doors, I heard the now familiar whoop whoop of a police cruiser. I was so arrested for driving under the influence. I blew a .2 about 12 hours after I had my last drink. If I had blown a .21, I would have gotten a felony charge. That led to years of failed drug tests, violated probations, and ultimately a year in jail down the line. After that, I decided enough was enough. These crazy people from Maryland and their insane concept of living could all go to hell for as much as I was concerned. It had been nearly 2 years of torment, fear, and unimaginable pain. Worst of all, it was starting to cost me my mind and my freedom. I was done listening to Josie and ready to start listening to my actual friends in town who had been begging me to stay away from those people for a long time now. Some good friends sat me down and started to tell me the inconsistencies in all their stories over the last few years. At first I didn't want to listen, but then eventually there was too much evidence not to listen. Finally I opened my ears and my mind on what was really going on. I decided to figure this out once and for all. I got on my MySpace, Facebook, and every other social media I could think of. I typed in Josie's full name into the search bar of every single one. What I found to this day still makes me want to turn my stomach contents inside out. There on every social media possible, by using her name and the few email addresses I knew she had, I found dozens and dozens of accounts linked to her emails. Duplicate after duplicate of Zachary's full name on accounts with pictures of her, and the same thing with Jacob and every single solitary other person in the supposed elites. That's when it finally, after years of denial and torment, finally freaking hit me like a railroad car full of bricks. My God, she's every single one of these people. She's absolutely and unequivocally made up every single solitary one of these people and has been pretending to be a dozen or more people for over 2 years. As you can imagine, my jaw hit the floor. Thank God I had some close friends there who kept me from falling apart and helped me find every single fake profile she had ever created. I was dumbfounded. Profile after profile after profile that had her pictures, but the names of people I thought were entirely real. Prototype accounts before she ended up making the actual fake accounts. Gags or jokes to her, really. In fact, all of this had been one big, insane, psychotic joke. I was too shocked to be enraged yet, but don't worry, that's coming. I diligently copied every link to every single one of her profiles in my AOL Instant Messenger, and then I called her. "Hey, how are you?" "I'm alright, I guess. Just bored. You?" "Nope. Definitely not bored over here. Get on AIM chat and I'll show you something really interesting." I was nearly hysterical at this point, and I could tell she knew something was up. Once she was online, I simply asked her, "Hey Josie, what are these?" Then I sent her the link to every single fake profile she had ever created in her miserable life, and a few from email accounts I didn't even know belonged to her. The silence on the other end of the line was deafening as I heard her clicking through link after link. Her 2-year-long mental game was over, and she finally realized it. Her words? "Well, man, guess you got me." She then started to laugh. Genuinely laugh as though something remotely funny had just occurred. I don't recall what I said, but apparently it was bad enough for my friends to take away the phone and have to hold me down. Catfish the show or movie wasn't around way back then, so I had unwittingly become one of the first hardcore victims of a stalker in the internet age. Worse than that, I had talked to, lived with, and even befriended the girl who had been stalking and trying to ruin my life for over 2 years. It was literally, and still is, the single biggest plot twist I have ever had in my entire life. thousands upon thousands of messenger conversations, hundreds and thousands of hours of phone conversation, countless amounts of cash being spent to drive up several states away just to stay with my psycho stalker every single time. Even bringing her down to live with me for months, having $5,000 mysteriously vanished out of my bank account. Everything was starting to make sense. There was no Jacob. There was no Zachary. There was no gang. What there actually was one completely insane girl with more mental problems than could fit in an encyclopedia. She was the only person I ever talked to. She was the only person I ever saw. And even worse, she was the one that paid Sean to come down to my house with a gun and try to kill my entire family. Josie was the only person in these last 2 years that had orchestrated any of this, from all the fake kidnappings and boyfriend drama to faking the death of someone I had fallen in love with and bringing him back just to screw with my head. Who does this? All the events of the last 2 years came flooding into my mind as I realized in each and every one it was solely her and no one else but her. So many questions raced through my head, the least of all being why me. I deleted my MySpace and made my Facebook private. I only accepted friends that I knew were real. I fell completely off the wagon and out of my head. Drugs, alcohol, and more drugs. That's all I could do to cope. Here I was, a gay man that had unknowingly fallen in love with a straight woman, and regardless of whether or not I thought it was a gay man, which I wholeheartedly did, that still messes with your head pretty bad. I didn't think I could ever be close to someone again. My world had been rocked and ruined. To this day, all these years later, I still don't trust people. I don't think I will ever be able to trust someone ever again. Can you blame me? She came down here. You heard me right. She moved into my sister town not even half an hour away from me. I bumped into her by accident and we started talking. Again, as much as I wanted to stomp her in a bloody pulp on the ground, you catch more flies with honey. I wanted answers. Hell, I deserved them. I told her I was trying to forgive her and I needed answers to my questions in order to do so. I asked her if she would sit down with me and tell me everything, and she reluctantly agreed. I politely informed her that this forgiveness was not for her, but it was for me so I could stop holding on to and living in the past. I explained she nearly killed me, ruined my life, and what she did was the most personal and horrific thing one human being can do to another, especially after I was so damn good to her. She was polite and let me get what I needed to get off my chest. I tried to be calm and not rude so she wouldn't run away, and I did get closure somewhat and answers to everything. Here's her explanation. Take it with a grain of salt. It started out as a joke when she was in high school. There was a girl who was being mean to her and bullying her, so she thought she would get back at her by getting her to like a guy online and reveal the awful truth later. She had made a bunch of prototype profiles and eventually almost 20 profiles in total, so it looked like this group of people had the same friends and they were real. She just pulled pictures off of freaking Google. She knew none of them were people in real life. She was having a good old time tricking this girl, when along comes a spider to mess up her web. Me. She said she thought she would just mess with me a bit and let me know she was actually a girl, but after talking to me, she unintentionally fell in love with me. Whether that's true or not, I don't know what to believe. If she really did love me, then why put me through pure freaking hell for 2 years? She said she wanted to tell me a million times, but it just got out of control, and before she knew it, she was really getting into being these people and somewhat believed she was them and they were real. Again, this chick is the world's best liar I have ever met, so who knows what the truth really is. All I wanted to know was how did she get the music and how did she sound like a guy on the phone? The music, as she shockingly demonstrated to me, was actually hers. She's an amazing pianist and guitar player. I saw this with my own eyes and heard it with my own ears. Zachary's voice in the phone wasn't very complicated. Paid a guy friend a few bucks to be in on it, which this jerk-off eagerly agreed to. Ruining someone's life for a few bucks. How sweet. Sean was all her. She paid him $500 to do that, and she had zero explanation as to why. She knew he would do it. He's just as much a psycho as she was. The rest of it was pure fantasy and imagination, all dolled up to be extra crazy so I would care more about Zachary and give her more attention. As lie after lie was finally revealed and the truth brought to life, I had heard enough after around 8 hours of this. I'd heard everything I really ever needed to hear and wanted to. My life was nearly destroyed, my family nearly killed, my mental and emotional health left scarred forever, simply because she wasn't getting enough attention in her life. Neither was I when all that started, but I didn't go about like a human wrecking ball trying to make myself feel better. I'll never be able to comprehend or understand the mind of someone like that, people who derive pleasure from other people's pain and misery. I'll never be able to fully trust, not in the way that's required of a true partner and companion. I just can't do that again. If I'm morally betrayed again, I know the next time will kill me. So as I write this in my apartment a little over a decade after it all happened, I'm alone. One good thing did come from this. It sure as hell made me the person I am today, and it strengthened and toughened my resolve into tempered steel. I learned to be okay with myself and to finally love myself after so many years of self-loathing. I'm a pretty amazing person. I don't need a man to define my life and who I am in any shape, form, or fashion. Obviously, I'm worth something. Otherwise, this psycho chick wouldn't have latched onto me for years and ended up moving 8 hours away from her home to be 30 minutes away from me all this time. What she stole, I will never get back. But what I gained, she can never take away from me again.